I would be shocked if there's any two people on the planet who have the exact same top 50 movies. I myself am probably going to disagree with my own list like 6 months from now. So how this is structured is that it's the top 5 movies from basically every major movie genre. I'm doing action, adventure, animation, comedy, crime, drama, fantasy, horror, mystery / thriller, science fiction, and war. The only major genres that I'm not including in this list are westerns, romance, and musicals. And that's just because I don't really watch those genres a lot. Nothing against them, it's just not really my thing. All right, so starting off, we're gonna do mysteries and thrillers. And at the number 5 spot, I have Brian De Palma's Blowout. I definitely had a pretty tough time deciding here whether I was going to do Parasite, Fight Club, or Blowout, but I ended up deciding to go with Blowout for the main reason being that I think the ending is absolutely amazing. I'm definitely not going to spoil it. I'm not going to spoil any of these movies in this video in case you haven't seen them. I will just say this, there's one thing in Blowout that is like perfectly set up throughout the movie and it just pays off so well at the end. And at the number 4 spot, I have Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, which is definitely my favorite Alfred Hitchcock movie. Obviously, he's made a lot of great movies, a lot of classics under his belt. Vertigo is my personal favorite. I'm definitely into like psychological thrillers. I like a little bit of surrealism to movies. And I think Vertigo, out of all of Hitchcock's discography, kind of does that the most. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like the trippiest or most surreal movie, but I think it does have just the right amount of it to really resonate with me personally. And I think it's one of the most beautifully shot movies of all time. And at the number 3 spot, I have Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. This is my favorite Stanley Kubrick movie. The movie definitely does have a lot of its issues. It's a very flawed movie, but the high points that the movie reaches are so good that it kind of just like erases all of the flaws for me personally. I love Eyes Wide Shut. There's a few scenes in particular that are some of my favorite scenes of all time, and I just absolutely love the vibes and the aura of this movie. It's super creepy. I love the subject matter. I find it really intriguing and interesting. And at the number 2 spot, I have Ingmar Bergman's Persona. I'm not really like 100% sure if this counts as a thriller, but it's listed as one on Wikipedia, so I'm just going to include it in the thriller category. But overall, I would definitely say Persona is kind of a movie that like transcends any genre, so I don't know. It's definitely a very abstract and confusing movie for sure. It took me 2 watches to like even have somewhat of an idea of what the movie's about. And at this point, I've seen it probably like 3 or 4 times, and I still wouldn't say I fully understand every aspect of the movie. The thing that really works so well about Persona, in my opinion, is the way that Ingmar Bergman uses lighting, blocking, and shadows to convey the story. Like if you just read the script of Persona, you really wouldn't have any idea of what the movie is actually about because so much of the storytelling is conveyed completely through images. And I know that's true of like most movies in general. Obviously, that's just like a foundation of filmmaking, but I think Persona is probably the best example of that I've seen in any movie. And at the number 1 spot for the thriller category, I have Mulholland Drive by David Lynch. Not only is this my favorite David Lynch movie, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's definitely heavily inspired by Persona, and also similar to Persona, it's a movie that is very difficult to understand the first time you watch it. But the thing that I love the most about Mulholland Drive is not necessarily like the story or like trying to piece together what the movie's about. It's more so just like the way that the movie makes you feel. And again, Mulholland Drive is also pretty much like an impossible movie to explain what's so great about it without spoiling. It makes you feel a way that no other movie does. All right, so the next category I'm looking at is science fiction, definitely one of my favorite genres. And at the number 5 spot, I have the original Total Recall movie from 1990. I'm a huge fan of Arnold. He's definitely one of my favorite like movie stars, action heroes of all time. Without a doubt, this is my favorite Arnold movie. It's got some of his best one-liners. The movie is also just absolutely unhinged and crazy. And at the number 4 spot, I have The Matrix. It's just insanely entertaining and has a really great and memorable sci-fi concept. It's super satisfying to watch Neo go down the rabbit hole, and the movie just completely exceeds your expectations going in about what is The Matrix. It's a classic for a reason. And at the number 3 spot, I have 2001: A Space Odyssey. Many people consider this to be Stanley Kubrick's magnum opus, and while it's not really my favorite Stanley Kubrick movie, it is definitely up there for me, and I definitely do agree that this is probably Stanley Kubrick at the peak of his filmmaking. Even if it's not my personal favorite, I like Eyes Wide Shut a little bit better, but I can't really deny that 2001: A Space Odyssey completely lives up to its reputation. It's definitely one of the most aesthetically pleasing and influential movies of all time. I wouldn't even necessarily say the movie even has as like a traditional narrative or a story. The concepts that it's addressing in this movie are just really interesting, and especially considering how ahead of its time this movie was. And at the number 2 spot, I have Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. And I will just say this, I've only ever seen the final cut. I never actually saw the original theatrical version. So maybe if I had seen that version first, like this wouldn't even be in my top 5. From what I've heard, the original theatrical cut of this movie kind of sucks. The final cut of Blade Runner is absolutely amazing in my opinion. It's kind of similar to 2001: A Space Odyssey in the sense that it's just like this amazing audio-visual experience. I absolutely love the setting and like the whole cyberpunk aesthetic and the Vangelis score. I'm not saying the movie's perfect because it definitely does have its issues, but like just purely on a vibes level, like Blade Runner is completely unmatched. And coming in at the number 1 spot for the sci-fi genre, I have Dune Part 2. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to assume that this is recency bias, and maybe it is. But in my defense, I was already a huge fan of the book going into this movie. I'm already extremely biased towards Dune. And in my opinion, I think Denis Villeneuve did pretty much as close to a perfect adaptation of the book as you could possibly do. I think all the changes he made were kind of necessary in order to translate it to a movie. And I actually think that in a lot of ways, the movie improves upon the book. But even setting all that aside, I just think it's such an entertaining movie, and I saw it in theaters multiple times, and it's definitely one of the best theatrical experiences I've ever had. Alright, so then up next is the horror genre. And at the number 5 spot for the horror genre, I'm going to put Alien. I think this is the quintessential sci-fi horror movie. I think the Xenomorph is one of the best creature designs in the history of cinema. I think Alien is pretty much just a perfect movie. Definitely one of the best horror movies of all time. And then at number 4, I have The Lighthouse. I know this movie is kind of meme-worthy in a lot of ways, but that's actually what I love so much about it. And the movie is basically like a horror movie about 2 roommates who just don't get along with each other. I love the over-the-top nautical dialogue. Willem Dafoe's performance in this movie is just absolutely amazing. And then at number 3, I have the 1981 Possession, which if you haven't seen this movie, you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it because it's one of the most bizarre and unhinged movies ever made. I think at the time it was released, it was like banned in several different countries just because it's so bizarre and crazy. A lot of people don't like it because like the acting performances are insanely over the top to the point where it's like almost hard to watch, and not necessarily in the sense of being bad acting, because I actually think it's really good acting because they're intentionally going really over the top. It's a movie where like it's actually kind of funny at times, but it's also like insanely uncomfortable to watch. I just absolutely love that about it. And if you're okay with like art house horror movies, then you definitely need to watch Possession. Even if you end up hating Possession, like one thing I can guarantee is that it will be one of the more memorable movies that you ever see. And at the number 2 spot, I have Rosemary's Baby. Yes, it is a controversial movie because of the director is a very terrible person. I'm gonna separate the art from the artist person. Like there's hundreds of people working on any film crew. Just because one person on the crew is a really terrible person doesn't mean I'm not gonna watch this movie. It's a great movie. It came out in like 1965, I think, or 1966, and it still absolutely holds up today. Not only because it's just such a great horror movie, but also like a lot of the social commentary of the movie was really ahead of its time and still extremely relevant today. And then at the number 1 spot for the horror category, I have a very basic pick here, but it is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Obviously, Stanley Kubrick was just a master at his craft, and it very much shows in The Shining. I know Stephen King hates the movie because I guess it wasn't a faithful adaptation of his book. I haven't read the book, so I don't know, maybe that would change my opinion on it. But looking at the movie purely as a standalone film, I think it absolutely lives up to its reputation. It's just a great movie through and through, and it's incredibly creepy. All right, so the next category I'm going to be looking at is war movies. And coming in at the number 5 spot for the war movie category, I do have Inglourious Basterds. And when it comes to this movie, I definitely do think it has a lot of flaws. The sum of its parts are greater than the whole, if that makes sense. Like I think it has a lot of great scenes, but the movie as a whole doesn't necessarily come together that well. But with that being said, I still decided to include it as my number 5 spot just because I think the movie is super entertaining, and I've rewatched it a number of times and it really never gets old. So even though I don't necessarily think it's like this masterpiece that some people hold it up to be, I just think it's such an entertaining and enjoyable movie to watch. And at the number 4 spot is Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Obviously, it's one of the most classic war movies of all time. Basically, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but then adapted to Vietnam. I do think that story kind of does adapt perfectly to the Vietnam War setting. And obviously, Francis Ford Coppola did such an amazing job of executing it. And at the number 3 spot, I have Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. I'm not like 100% sure that this would really count as a war movie, but I'm just going to count it anyway. I think as much as 2001: A Space Odyssey gets credit for how visually amazing it is, which it definitely is, I actually think Barry Lyndon is Stanley Kubrick's most aesthetically pleasing movie. Every frame in Barry Lyndon looks like a Renaissance painting, and it's just insane that they pretty much did all that with mostly natural lighting. And it has like this really cool epic storyline. The only downside I have against the movie is the main character. I think the actor's name is Ryan O'Neal. I'm kind of blanking on it. I'm pretty sure that's his name. Anyway, the main actor, like, I don't think he's necessarily that good of an actor, and I also don't think he's really that convincing at playing Barry Lyndon's character. He's supposed to be like this con artist who manipulates his way up the social hierarchy. I don't know, you just don't really buy it coming from Ryan O'Neal, because he just doesn't really give off the energy of like this charismatic swindler who kind of like cons his way to the top. I also do think that that is kind of intentional, because part of like the message of the movie, it's supposed to be kind of like absurd, where like this guy is kind of an idiot who kind of just gets lucky and lucks his way up through the social ladder. I do think the movie probably would have been better if they had a different leading actor, but still overall I think Barry Lyndon is a masterpiece. And then at the number 2 spot, I have Beau Travail, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, but whatever. And I also don't really know if this technically counts as a war movie, but because it's about the French Foreign Legion, then I'm just going to include it as a war movie anyway. And Beau Travail is definitely a very interesting movie. I definitely do think a lot of people would probably find it boring, but I personally did not find it boring, just because I was so impressed with the cinematography throughout the entire thing. And really the main thing that I actually liked about it was the needle drops. Like, there's one needle drop in particular that is just like one of the best needle drops of all time, and it really elevated this movie. Like, honestly, this movie probably wouldn't even be in my top 5 war movies if it wasn't for one particular scene towards the end of the movie. And if you've seen the movie, you probably know what I'm talking about. Definitely not going to spoil that one, but if you haven't seen Beau Travail, you should definitely check it out, because it has one of the best endings ever. And then at the number 1 spot for war movies, I have The Battle of Algiers, which came out in 1966. This is a movie where it's definitely like really hard to watch. Not necessarily that it's not entertaining. I guess entertaining would be the wrong word to describe this movie, just because it's so like brutal and gruesome, and it's covering like such heavy subject matter. But the movie definitely does have like good pacing, and it's very well made in a lot of different aspects. But the reason why I have this at my number 1 spot is because this movie will completely change your perspective about war and violence. I read somewhere that they've actually screened this movie at the Pentagon for training purposes. I really do think this is a movie that like should be taught in schools. Like, I think everyone should watch this movie. Even though it came out in 1966, it's still extremely relevant to this day. All right, so next up, we're going to be looking at fantasy. At the number 5 spot, I do have Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl. I will admit that a lot of this is nostalgia. I used to absolutely love this movie as a kid. I think it still holds up to this day. Say what you will about the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise as a whole. Like, the first movie was pretty much a perfect blockbuster movie in my opinion. Absolutely amazing score by John Williams. Jack Sparrow is a great character. And if I were really to just describe this movie in one word, it's just fun. And for the number 4 spot in the fantasy genre, I have Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. Spoiler alert for the rest of the list. This is my least favorite of the Lord of the Rings movies, but I still think it's a masterpiece. And then at the number 3 spot in the fantasy genre, I have Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. I know a lot of people would consider Star Wars to be a sci-fi series. That makes sense because obviously it's got like spaceships and lasers and all that. But to me, I actually think Star Wars is more fantasy than it is sci-fi, because it doesn't really explore any sci-fi concepts. It doesn't really have a lot of the defining features of the sci-fi genre. It's a movie about good versus evil and magic and space wizards and stuff. So I kind of consider it to be more fantasy than sci-fi. But either way, it doesn't really matter, because The Empire Strikes Back is an absolutely amazing movie. In my opinion, it's the best Star Wars movie by a long shot. Yoda is one of the best characters in all of Star Wars. Darth Vader gives probably the best paternity reveal in the history of cinema. And overall, like, pretty much everything about this movie is just classic from start to finish. And then at the number 2 spot, I have Lord of the Rings: Return of the King. This movie is very close to being the number 1 Lord of the Rings movie for me. I think the best moments in the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy happen in Return of the King. This movie is so epic. It hits you emotionally. It's just such a great culmination to the trilogy. But the movie does have a few issues here and there. I think the endings kind of drag on a little bit. I think some of the CGI doesn't necessarily look that great. I think the way they handled the Army of the Dead wasn't exactly ideal. But setting all those nitpicks aside, I still think Return of the King is one of the greatest movies of all time. And of course, my number 1 fantasy movie is The Fellowship of the Ring, which in my opinion, out of the 3 Lord of the Rings movies, I think this is the most perfect one. I don't really think that there's any movie that's actually perfect, but I think Fellowship of the Ring is about as close to perfect as you could realistically get, especially with a movie on this scale. My favorite aspect of this movie is just the adventure focus of it. Two Towers and Return of the King are almost more like war movies in some ways. The Fellowship of the Ring is a true adventure movie, and I just absolutely love how it starts off in paradise in the Shire, and then as they venture out of the Shire, it just gets more and more dangerous, and the farther away that they get from the Shire, the more the hobbits kind of lose their innocence. I really do think people are going to be watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy like 500 years from now. I think they're that good. Alright, so now the next category I'm going to do is dramas. And at the number 5 spot, I have The Shawshank Redemption. And I know a lot of people think this movie is kind of overrated, and I kind of get what they're saying. It's not really like a groundbreaking movie by any means, but like, I don't know, I just think it's so effective at what it's doing. Every single time I watch The Shawshank Redemption, I'm immediately hooked into it and invested from start to finish, and it just packs such an emotional punch. I'm a sucker for this movie. I just think it's absolutely riveting, and maybe it's not the greatest movie of all time like it's ranked on like certain websites, but I think it's up there though. Just because it's ranked like number 1 on IMDb, I don't think that's like a valid reason to criticize it. Like, I don't think being overrated is even really a valid critique of a movie. Like, I just look at the movie by itself regardless of how it's rated, and I think it's amazing. And coming at the number 4 spot for dramas, I have All That Jazz, which I guess technically is kind of a musical. I'm including it in the drama category, and I'm really not someone who likes musicals, but I think All That Jazz is amazing. Like, even if you don't like musicals, you definitely need to watch this movie. And it's not like other musicals where they'll just like randomly have characters start like singing and dancing in the middle of a scene. All the musical numbers in this movie are built into the story because the story is literally about the director of a musical theater production. All the musical numbers make sense with the story, and it doesn't take you out of it in any way. And even with that being said, the musical numbers are actually really, really good in this. More so, what makes this movie so great is just like, it's just like this really great personal story about a very flawed character. The main character is played by Roy Scheider, who's known for playing in Jaws, but I think that he is absolutely amazing in this movie. Like, it's such a great acting performance. And the movie also does have like kind of a bit of a like a psychedelic vibe to it. Like, it kind of puts you into a trance. And one of the best things about this movie is how great the editing is. Like, it's one of the most well edited movies I've ever seen. So if you haven't seen All That Jazz, even if you don't like musicals, do yourself a favor and watch this movie. It's so worth it. And then at the number 3 spot in the drama category, I have Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights. I don't fault anyone who would say that maybe like There Will Be Blood or The Master or Phantom Thread are Paul Thomas Anderson's best movies. I get why people would say that. But for me personally, I just enjoy Boogie Nights the most. I just love the whole setting and vibe of this movie. I love the characters. I definitely am kind of a sucker for like the 60s, 70s, 80s California aesthetic. Like, there's something about that's very appealing to me. And I think Boogie Nights does one of the best jobs of any movies of recreating that setting, but it also does it in a very unique way that you're really not going to see in very many other movies. I just think Boogie Nights is an absolutely delightful movie to watch at times, but it also at times does get very dark and depressing, but it also just has like this super bombastic and incredible scene towards the end with Alfred Molina's character. I just love Boogie Nights. And then at the number 2 spot for the drama category, I have a recent movie that came out this year, and it is Challengers. Honestly, the main reason why I love Challengers so much is because of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. They are my current favorite film composers working in the industry today. I think they are absolutely amazing at what they do. And I think Challengers is the second best musical score they've ever delivered. But even on top of the music, like the way the tennis scenes are directed in this movie are just so entertaining to watch. And then at the number 1 spot in the drama category, I have The Social Network. A movie about Facebook sounds like it would be incredibly lame on paper, but this movie is just so well executed in every single aspect of filmmaking that it doesn't even matter if the subject matter is lame on paper, because the movie is just absolutely brilliant. And while this movie is definitely historically inaccurate and not really an accurate representation of Mark Zuckerberg as a real life person, if you just view this movie purely from the perspective that it's kind of like a fictional story that loosely is inspired by reality, I think that's the best way to look at this movie. And I think it's pretty much just like this perfect Shakespearean tragedy of a story. And yes, as you can tell, I love Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. They also did the score for this movie like they did with Challengers. And in this case, I do think that this is the best Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross score. And then up next, we have the action adventure category. In the number 5 spot, I have Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I was debating between this or Oldboy. Most people would say that Oldboy is a much better movie than Temple of Doom, and I wouldn't argue with you if you said that. I mean, you're probably right. But if I'm just being honest with myself, I've rewatched Temple of Doom like so many times and it never gets old for me. So if I'm just being realistic with myself, yeah, like Temple of Doom goes in the number 5 spot. I know the movie is controversial, and I think that's valid if you don't like the movie for certain reasons, but for me personally, I'm willing to let it slide. And I love Temple of Doom. I think it's an amazing movie. And then in the number 4 spot, I have Mad Max Fury Road. I guess you would maybe be able to put this in the sci-fi category, but I'm just including in the action adventure category because this movie is basically just pure action. And yeah, it's Mad Max Fury Road. It's such a legendary movie for a reason. The action is obviously incredible in this movie, but also what this movie does really well is it has really amazing character development relative to how little dialogue there actually is. The script for this movie is very bare bones, yet it's still able to effectively develop these characters. And yeah, I just think it's a really impressively made movie. And then at the number 3 spot, I have Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. Yes, I have it above Mad Max Fury Road. This is purely a personal preference list, so I'm not saying Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is like an all-time masterpiece, but I just have a soft spot for the Planet of the Apes franchise. I've always loved it, and I would say Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is probably my favorite of all of the Planet of the Apes movies. It's definitely kind of close with the original 1968 one, but yeah, I kind of like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes a little bit better. I know also could probably be considered sci-fi, but I just decided to throw it in the action category because, like, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a movie about chimpanzees riding horses and shooting AK-47s. And then at the number 2 spot, I have Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This was actually probably my favorite Indiana Jones movie when I was a little kid. And yeah, to this day, I definitely still do love the Last Crusade, but for me, it's just a little bit behind the number 1 spot, which is Raiders of the Lost Ark. In my opinion, this is a perfect adventure movie. I love Steven Spielberg, but this is definitely my favorite Spielberg movie. Like, obviously, the opening intro scene does this great job of introducing you to Indiana Jones and like how he's like this amazing adventurer and he's like super charismatic, Harrison Ford. But then I love how immediately after that, it shows the other side of Indiana Jones where he's like this professor who's like super knowledgeable and interested in archaeology. And I just think that that introduction to Indiana Jones' character perfectly sets him up to get you invested in him for the rest of the series. And then yeah, obviously the rest of the movie is just amazing action, amazing set pieces, really funny moments, like just great characters. All right, then next up we have the crime genre. At the number 5 spot, I have the movie Paper Moon from 1973. And if you haven't seen this movie, it's pretty much actually like a road trip movie where it's about this con artist and huckster who like goes around door to door selling Bibles and just kind of scamming people. And then he comes across like this like 10-year-old who ends up like getting in on his scams. And then they kind of just drive across the country like doing all these scams. And yeah, it's just pretty much like a perfect road trip movie. Like the movie is just so entertaining. If you haven't seen Paper Moon, you definitely need to watch it. And then at the number 4 spot, I have City of God, which is very similar to like a movie like Goodfellas, or at least like heavily inspired by Scorsese movies. But then it's like the Brazilian version of that. It is like a very gruesome movie with a lot of terrible things happening, but it's still just insanely entertaining and riveting to watch. And I love the way that it shows the evolution of the City of God from like the 1960s through the 1970s. And you get to see these characters from when they were little kids and then how they grow up. It's such a great movie, and like everything ties together so well. At the number 3 spot, I have Pulp Fiction, which is the best Tarantino movie in my opinion. And along with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think it's Tarantino's funniest movie. And then in the number 2 spot, I have The Godfather, which is considered by many to be one of the greatest movies of all time. I think it lives up to its reputation, and I'm specifically talking about Godfather Part 1. I know a lot of people prefer Part 2, and Part 2 is amazing, but I personally like Godfather Part 1 better, and I just love seeing the story of Michael Corleone in The Godfather Part 1. It's just such a great story. And then at number 1, I have Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. I think what's so great about Goodfellas too is that pretty much throughout the entire movie, like it just goes from iconic scene to iconic scene to iconic scene. I would say my favorite scene in the movie is probably that famous tracking shot scene with the crystals playing in the background, but also pretty much any scene that involves Joe Pesci's character. All right, and then the next category I'm doing is comedy movies. And at the number 5 spot for comedies, I do have Mean Girls, and maybe some of this is nostalgia because I've always loved Mean Girls, like ever since I watched it, like pretty much as a kid. I still think that Mean Girls holds up very well to this day, and it's just one of the most quotable and funny movies of like the 2000s. And at the number 4 spot, I have Heathers, which is very similar to Mean Girls. Like, it's basically Mean Girls, except a little bit edgier, and it has murder in it. And I really had a tough time deciding between Mean Girls or Heathers and which one is better. But I ended up deciding to go with Heathers just because I like the fact that it's just a little bit darker and edgier. I guess I am like a little bit of an edgelord in some ways, but I just absolutely love Heathers. Like Mean Girls, it's just incredibly funny and quotable. And yeah, it's a classic that holds up to this day. And then at the number 3 spot for comedies, I have American Psycho, which I know I guess you could consider this movie as like a thriller or a horror movie, but for me, this movie is mostly just like a comedy. Like, I think this movie is absolutely hilarious. I know this movie has kind of become like a meme in a lot of ways, but I mean, I still think it's an amazing movie. Like, Patrick Bateman's monologues in this movie are absolutely hilarious. I think the soundtrack of the movie is like really good, but it's also perfectly fitting for like the satire that the movie is going for. But yeah, overall, American Psycho is a movie I've just seen it so many times, and it's still hilarious every single time. And then at the number 2 spot, I have Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This is a movie that I used to be absolutely obsessed with when I was a little kid. There was even a point where I was like maybe like 8 or 9 years old where I dressed up as Sir Galahad from this movie for Halloween. And I went around trick-or-treating, like doing like the horse gallop, and my parents were doing the fake coconut thing behind me. And I still remember that to this day. I absolutely love Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Definitely one of the funniest movies of all time. And then at the number 1 spot, I have The Big Lebowski, which is my favorite Coen Brothers movie. I just think it's so funny, and I love the style of humor in this. And the way that the comedy is written in The Big Lebowski is that like a lot of the jokes are funnier like the more you get to know the characters. So that's why like the more you rewatch the movie, it gets funnier every time. After you've seen the movie a few times, you understand like these characters very well, and it just makes all the jokes even funnier. I mean, the movie is definitely very dumb, and like the story makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't really matter just because it's extremely funny. All right, the last category I'm doing is animation, and I'll be honest, like I don't really watch a lot of animated stuff, and most of the movies in my top 5 animations are just movies that I liked as a kid. And so at the number 5 spot, I have Spirited Away. And honestly, if I had watched this movie as a kid, then this might even be like number 1. Like, it probably is like the best animated movie that I've seen. But just because I watched it like when I was older already, it probably just didn't quite resonate as much as the other animated movies on this list. But Spirited Away is an absolute masterpiece in my opinion. And then at the number 4 spot, I have Finding Nemo. At the number 3 spot, I have Monsters, Inc. At the number 2 spot, I have Shrek. And at number 1, I have Toy Story. There isn't really any particular reason other than I just loved all of those 4 movies ever since I was a little kid.